in chapter 7 is explain a lot of the stuff that they have just thrown out there in the past and not really done much with. All right. So like I said, that's kind of what we got so far. Now, I did not have a chance last night to go back and take a look and try to fix the case study 6.1. I do promise you I will try to do that tonight. All right. Tomorrow is set up to be a lab day for you to begin to continue working on the projects 6.1 and 6.2, the case study 6.1, the case study 7.1, and the 7.1 project. So you'll have lab for 2 straight days. What that will also allow me to do is by tomorrow, I want to have your test graded. I do have the homework graded through chapter 5, but I don't have your test graded yet. All right. So I will do that tomorrow. As it says here, then on Monday, we will go over chapter 8. All right. There is no homework due this week, as this says. All right. So next week, and this will hopefully give you a good chance to get working on that. So next Sunday, 1 week from Sunday, your chapter 6, your chapter 7, your chapter 8, written tests, labs, and homework will all be due by midnight on that night. All right. So with that said, let's go right
Mr.
in.
Scott,
Go ahead.
I know you just said that you didn't have any of the tests graded, but when I
Yes.
looked on the inside ranking, you already, it said you graded my test. I don't know if you put in like a different grade or something. So
I'll double check.
okay,
Let's put it this way. One of the students in the class is having a problem with their test. Okay. That's why I didn't really do any more than that. I will take a look at it. I did start grading them, but I didn't think I put the grades in yet. I'll take a look right after class though. All right. Whoops. Let me jump in here to chapter 7. There we go. Now, am I sharing? Can you see 7 on the screen?
you're not sharing.
I'm not sharing. Okay. So I figured that usually when I start sharing like this, it kicks me out and then it makes me share again. So can you see it now?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. All right, so let's start. As they mentioned here in chapters 2 and 4, we learned basic Razor view and layout skills, but now they're going to expand upon them. So they will talk in more depth and breadth of coverage on Razor syntax. So some of the stuff that they mentioned here, we've already done, is what I'm saying. You've already done inline loops. We haven't done anything really conditionally, meaning that we've done something where we've used an if or a switch, but we've done the inline loops. You've done the for loop in here before. All right. Some of the other stuff, they're going to explain some of these tag helpers and the like in depth and breadth of coverage. One thing about Murach books is what they typically do is they do talk to people out in the business. So for instance, the reason I'm telling you that, when we get to the section on more skills with views and we talk about URLs, they're going to show you 3 or 4 ways of doing the same thing. Sometimes they would, what'll happen is they will recommend one, and when they recommend one, it'll be for one of 2 reasons. All right, either it'll be because it's easier for the end user, or it'll be because that's the standard way of doing it. All right. Now, I may have told you this. I don't want to bore you with my stories, but I just want to give you one that's fairly short. I had a student many years ago when I was teaching in Wisconsin. He was a retired Air Force. I don't know what he was. He was higher than a sergeant, but he wasn't up to a colonel, but he was something in there. A very nice gentleman. All right. His family immigrated from India, and he was unbelievably intelligent. All right. Well, the point is this. He interviewed for a job, and I thought he was perfect for the job, and I actually thought he'd get it. And the day after he interviewed, it was near the end of the semester where he was about to graduate. He came in, and I said, "How did it go?" And he said it was weird. He said the interview was going great. And then they asked me what if I'd ever looked at their website. And I said, yes. And they said, what do you think of it? And I said, well, I make some suggestions to you. And he said, then I went on for about 10 minutes. The bottom line is this. He wasn't even working for the company, and then he was telling them how to do things. I think that's how it came across. And I kind of mentioned that to him, and he said, well, I don't think that I was doing that. I said, maybe you don't think so, but that might have been the way it was coming across to them. The reason I'm bringing this up to you is typically what Murach will show you is the standard way of doing things. And when you get hired into a company, you want to fit in. If you say, no, I want to stand out, you want to make sure that you're at the company for a while before you start to stand out. So you want to fit in. All right. So we'll talk about how to work with a model, how to work with multiple razor layouts. And then this is interesting because I have not looked at this before, but I am going to at the end of class. And it's in the last 4 or 5 pages in here, this Guitar Shop website. Okay. All right. So they start with coming in here and talking about how to use razor syntax. And again, some of the stuff that's in here is not new. They talk about a razor code block. If you've got a razor code block that is just a single line, you preface it with the @ sign. You already know that. If you've got a razor actual code block that contains multiple statements, meaning that it's an inline expression, you begin it with an @ sign, then you put it in curly braces. All right. There shouldn't be anything that's new in there. All right. So I don't think, like I said, that stuff that they're saying in there is really new. Now, they mention that sometimes when you put things in, parentheses are not mandatory. Other times when you put things in, parentheses are mandatory. What does that mean? That means bottom line, if you are in doubt, use them. All right. Okay, so here's the difference between these. Really, the one we've used here most has been like at model. And you'll notice, and they'll talk about this later in the chapter as well. But when you do an at model, all right, up there at the top of your screen, you use a lowercase m, and you basically put the name of the model you are using. Then in your code later on, you use an uppercase M with the at model because now it's going to be at model dot something. And they'll talk about this again later on in the chapter as well. All right. So again, there's an example here. There's just a simple example right there with an expression, etc. And you know already, we've talked about this, looking at what you see on your screen right here, that I have likened before using a .cshtml to having JSX where you can put HTML inside of your JavaScript. Well, in here, it's a CSHTML, and what we're doing is we're putting C# into our HTML. And you know this already. Again, there shouldn't be anything that's new in here. All right. You'll notice here it says welcome back, etc. So what do we have? We've got this string, all right, that says message. All right. And now it says here if customer name is not equal to null, well, it's not because up here we set it to John. All right. And what they're saying there is if it's not null, we want to give them the message, welcome back. So as you can see in here, there is the message. Now, the reason I'm even bringing this up is you'll notice that in this case, okay, we are basically sticking an if statement inside of our razor block. All right, totally legit to do that. Then they also mention this is all part of the same file here, okay? And really it starts here in that you've set this name here. Then when we go down to here, again, we take our C# and we make sure that it's segregated in this case from our HTML, unless we want to print out a value of something. So at message is this, all right? Now, if we had not set up a name, all right, then you probably, when you were writing this, you probably would have wanted to, come in here. Notice they've got this at message. All right, so here message is this, and here it's this. So it's either going to say welcome if that had not been said, or welcome back if it had been said. Now, I don't mean to insult your intelligence. I really don't. You might be like, well, that's simple stuff. We've done that back in the AWD 1100 class. But yeah, but now we're doing it, for lack of better words, right inside of a web page. All right. So that at message that you see there, that is adding some razor code. All right. Then you'll notice under the customer name, it should be John because that's what we set there. So customer name, John. All right. So you can use a view bag statement right inside of your HTML. But again, just like with message, which is a C# razor variable, basically, that anytime we want to put any C# code in, we have to preface it with this. Finally, the last example that they're showing in here, the 2 plus 2 equals this, and this should make sense to all of you, this right here, just that part, that's just a string. It's not in double quotes, but it's a string literal, basically. It's like if you typed hello in there, it's the same thing. But since we want to actually perform an operation here, we want to do some math, for lack of better words. All right. We're doing math, but we're doing math using C#. You've been used to, or at least I think you have, in the past, and I think for the 1100 class, you both had Evan, but in there, once we got into JavaScript, you could put JavaScript in there, for example. All right, we're doing the same kind of thing. All right, and I'll let you look at this, but I think we pretty much have gone through it now. Okay. All right. So how to code inline loops. Again, we have talked about these before. All right. As it says, within these loops, you can use H tags to send HTML to a view. All right. So if we look at that example that's right there, what are we doing? Well, we are filling up a drop-down list with all of the values between 1 and 12. So if this was going to be part of, of a web page, maybe we would be asking, for example, in there, maybe this would be something for credit cards. And we would have a month, and then maybe we next to it, we'd have a year where they would have to put down the month, the whatever it's good till, the month it's good to, and the year that it's good to, etc. All right, as an example. But again, the point is we have razor code in here, and we are mixing, all right, razor variables, and we are mixing them along with regular HTML. And that's what they're talking about. All right. Then it says in the second example, it says it sets up a controller to provide the data that's being used by the view in the third example. Okay. To do that, it says it creates a list of musical instrument categories, and it stores that list in the categories property of the view bag. All right. So that's this example here that's going to be used down here. So again, what are we doing here? All right. It says viewbag.categories equals a new list of type string. All right. And these will be its values. Now, this isn't database. This is not database, but you could kind of look at it that what we're doing here is we're seeding a C# string list with these 3 values. All right. And then after we do that, we're iterating our way through this, and you'll notice what it says. With each case, again, we're doing a mixing here. All right. And we're saying that the href is going to be go to product, go to list, and under product list, go to the category. So product list guitars, product list basses, and product list drums. So this is where it'll go, the stuff that's right here. And this that's right here is grabbing the name that's in here and putting those names in. So the first part is the location, and the second part is the name. It's sort of similar to when we were working, for example, with drop-down lists, and you might have had a drop-down list of states where with the states, you would have showing on the screen Missouri, Minnesota, etc., all those states. But what we were actually storing was the state abbreviation. All right. So again, if you need more of an explanation or a better one than I just gave you, okay, you can look at what they say here. Now they do mention in here, it says to keep these examples simple, this figure doesn't use any bootstrap classes or tag helpers, but you typically would. So in other words, later in the chapter, they're going to bring some of this stuff in to pretty it up. Right now, they're just concerned with showing you stuff on screen. All right. So you can code inline loops rather within a view, and you can use HTML tags to send HTML to the view. All right. I don't really think that's a lot of new stuff. We've been doing stuff like that, but as I mentioned to you before, in this chapter, there's a lot of hopefully aha types of moments where you go, oh, that's why we did that type of an idea. And that's the way that I looked at this chapter when I read it. All right. So in the next figure here, as they mentioned, they will be coding inline conditional loops. All right. So who cares? Well, again, it's not that it's that big a thing, but notice in here, it's an add if. All right. So you can see basically in here, you can see where it starts. All right. So everything in here is part of it. All right. And what are we checking? Well, we need that because we're checking view bag stuff. All right. Now, would there be another way to write this? I'm sure that we could, basically put the if inside of here, so to speak. So put it inside of here and then surround some of the stuff. But what they're trying to show you in here is if you use an if else and you preface the if at the beginning, or you preface in here the @ sign at the beginning of the switch, this is all part of the same inline block, so to speak, be it an if else or be it a case. All right. And they're doing the same thing. What they're saying is what we want to put in here, all right, is basically we want to say whether or not we are looking at a Fender Stratocaster, a Gibson Les Paul, or we don't know. So all we're doing is we're checking the product ID, and that product ID we're assuming here has been passed in. All right. So this is not, this code that you see here is not here in an island unto itself. It'll be in a file. And we're assuming that the product ID was passed in. And if it's one of these two, it'll set those accordingly. Otherwise, it says the product isn't found. And again, they're showing it both with an if, and they're showing it with a switch. I should say an if else, and a switch. All right. So in here, they're explaining everything. So as it says, the first example uses an if else to check the product ID property of the view bag. Then it displays the paragraph tag if it finds a match, or no product if it doesn't find a match. The second example, as it says in there, is the same as the first. The only difference is that rather than using an if else statement, it is using a switch. All right, then the third example, which we'll look at in a moment, it says it uses a C# if statement to check if a selected category name property of the view bag is equal to the value of all. It says if so, it adds the class active, all right, to the A element. Okay, it marks the item as being active. All right, it says to make this work, the example uses the text tag to set the active tag or the active class to plain text. So if we look at this one right here, this is in the middle, and you can see there is, for lack of better words, there is regular C sharp, or regular HTML, I should say, in here. Then there is C sharp. All right. And since it's C sharp, all right, we're adding the razor stuff in here. Okay. All right. And then finally, with the last example, it says it converts a simple if statement that uses inline. You know what this is already. In other words, what is it using in here? It is using the question mark colon, the ternary operator. So in other words, it's saying if this is equal to all, mark it as active. If it's not equal to all right, do the equivalent of marking it null, which is unknown, which is basically the empty set here. All right. All right. So again, this next section in here, good, bad, indifferent, whatever you want to call it, it says, now that you understand the syntax, you're ready to learn some essential skills for working with views. To start, you're ready to learn how to set up starting folders for the files. And again, much of this stuff we've already had, but I believe at least this has been the kind of thing where we've done things because we've been told to do them, or it's been set up for us. But now basically we're going through it with the guise of we're explaining what's going on in here. So as it says, this is the files for the guitar website that sells musical instruments. And I guess that starting in this particular chapter, they're going to start going through this guitar shop. I want to look at it because if it's a good enough example, maybe we can use it or make something similar from it to try to make sure we getting these ideas across. Okay, so you'll notice this is very similar to the type of stuff we've done before. It's a guitar shop. So let's start with the models. We've got a category model, we've got a product model, we've got a shop context, all right, which is going to tie the two together. From there, we've got a home controller, we've got a product controller, all right. In the home controller, we've got just an index and an about. All right. With the product controller, we've got more of the stuff that we've been doing in the past. In other words, we've got the basic CRUD. We can list all of them. We can list a single one, and we can do updates the way that this is set up right now. They do in here at the end of the chapter when they start to go through it, this guitar shop model is not yet complete. They're kind of building it incrementally. In addition, there are these two files in here, this view imports and this view start. And the view imports, basically, if you've ever looked at it, I think it's about 2 or 3 lines long, and it says it imports models and tag helpers. So rather than us having to preface things like this ASP dash this or whatever, we don't have to because we're doing the view import. All right. And the view start, typically what it says is, hey, it's going to specify that we're using the same default layout for everything that we're working with. So in other words, they'll all be set up the same way. In our www, you've seen this already. We've got this, all right, which is our CSS. We've also got Bootstrap. Typically, there's other stuff in there. There may be jQuery, all right, and there may be, even other, some JavaScript, etc. in there. Okay. The program.cs, as it says, it configures the middleware. We've been doing that. We've been configuring the middleware for quite a while. What do I mean? Well, when we did the use SQL server, we were adding middleware. When we added the slug and the ability to make things lowercase, we were adding middleware. Now, when we went in yesterday and we were fidgeting with the controllers and resetting or setting routes, we were configuring middleware. All right. So again, that's all explained here in a lot of depth. I just don't want to read to you, all right, any more than you probably want me to read to you. So if if you're not happy with the description I'm giving you and you have your book, then while I'm going through it, look at the page on the left-hand side as I'm going through the page on the right-hand side. All right. Okay. So the routing that's specified, we've already talked about this. This is the default that you get. All right. So by convention, you store the views for an MVC app in a series of folders and files, names that correspond to the controller, all right, and the action methods that return the views. All right. But again, if we've got a controller that's called home controller, we've got a home folder. Product controller, a product folder. In other words, in views, you leave the word controller off where it's used on the name of the controller. Nothing new there. And again, the program.cs file contains that middleware that you bring into the project so that you're able to do things with it otherwise you wouldn't be able to do. All right. So next, it says now we're going to talk about how to code controllers that return views. And guess what? This is what you've been doing. All right. In those controllers, you've been typically returning a view. And as it says, typically you use the view method to create view result objects. Then you return that object. All right. So as they mentioned, by default, the view method creates a view result object. All right. But if you don't want it to work that way, you don't have to. They even say here, all right, it says in this figure, for example, the index method names the list method of the view in the view method. All right. So in other words, you don't have to return a view from where you currently are. You don't even have to return a view from the controller you're currently in. And that's what they mention in here. All right. So it says here, all of the action methods in this figure specify rather a return type of iAction result. Even though you learned yesterday, you can also use that content result in there if you want to just display text as opposed to displaying some kind of a view. And again, typically the content result is used early in the testing phase. All right. Okay. Now we look at the table that's in here. Notice view paren and view paren name paren. Well, if it's just view paren as it says, it creates a view result that corresponds to the name of the current controller and the current action. So in other words, I'm in the home controller and I'm in the index method. So right here, that's what this will return. And I'm hoping at least that by now this is making sense. If it didn't before, or if it did, it's just a matter of this being review. All right. The other one that they show there, the view name, as it says, it creates a view result object that corresponds to the current controller and the specified view name. So when we look here, we're in index, but we're returning the list. So in other words, we're returning the code that is in here. It must be under product because we're not giving it another name. All right. So we're in the product controller. But if we had just left this blank, it would be returning views product index. But since we say list, it's views product list.cshtml. All right. Okay. Here's an example of a list, but notice that we're passing in here, we're passing in an ID. And here it's an ID of all, so we're passing this back. Now, this is pretty important concept. All right. This is very similar to the add edit stuff that we were doing in that. What I mean is you're able to use the same method, whether you're returning it from here as a view list or you're returning it here as just a view, it's the same file that's being called. So again, an advantage of doing this is if you want to return the same thing, but from different parts of your code, it's an example of dry. Do not repeat yourself. You write the code once, and you just have to make sure that when you return it, you put in the correct path, so to speak, of where you want to return it from. All right. And then finally in here, notice its details. All right. Well, we're returning view, but we've set in here the slug, etc. All right. So it's smart enough to be able to figure out that since we're in details, it's going to product details. All right. And again, that's exactly what they're saying right here. All right. Next, as it says here, how to create a default layout and enable tag helpers. All tag helpers are designed to do is, for lack of better words, they're things prefaced with ASP dash that makes it easier to write the ASP.NET that interfaces directly with your HTML normally inside of a form. So as it says here, figure 7.6 shows the code that's necessary to create a default layout and enable tag helpers. All right. This is the stuff that we've been using. This is the layout file that by default, you've got at view bag title. It has a link in here to your CSS, and typically, again, a link in here to your Bootstrap, and there may be other stuff that gets added too. And then inside of the body, it's just render body. Since this is shared, that body that's in there becomes the body of really whatever .cs HTML file you are currently using. All right. And this view start basically just says, hey, we're using the same layout for everything. All right. And where it says that underscore layout, that's this. It says we're using this. So this file right here uses a razor statement to say that your layout by default will be this layout, which says to render, all right, the body of whatever is in the current CS HTML file that you're working with. All right. In addition, this is enabling the tag helpers. All right. So you don't have to go and put, if you didn't put this in, you would have to either put it in at the top of every file that used it, or you would have to take all those ASP dash things that you use and preface them all with Microsoft.ASPCore.MVC.TagHelpers. Which would be a real waste of time. All right. Okay. So it says there how to add a razor layout. And right click as it says on the folder, and you can use a new add item. All right. And then notice what comes next. It says make sure you select the ASP.NET Core Web category and you select the razor item that you want to add to the resulting dialog boxes. And we have done this. We have gone in. I showed you in an earlier example when we went in and we created a brand new controller, all right, as an empty controller. And then we went in and we manually added inside of the views folder a file with the same name as the controller. I think we used product or something. So we created the product file. Then inside of there, we created empty razor files where we had, again, like an add item.cshtml, a list.cshtml, and a delete.cshtml typically. All right. And that's pretty much what they're saying in here. Again, if you don't agree or you need more, take a look at the stuff that's in here. All right. All right. And again, I don't know if you guys are reading the book. I take for granted because you seem to be catching on to the material that you are, but at a minimum, you should always be looking at the odd number page, all right? And like it is here, and look at any code they show you and or any tables they show you and any steps they show you for doing things. And when they typically, on most pages at least, will put some kind of a summary at the bottom. All right. I mean, I've had people say this to me before. This book's way too long. There's 700 and some pages in it. I don't know exactly how many there are, but I don't know. I think it's about 760 or 770 pages. Yeah, that's a big book. All right. So the next thing that's discussed here, and this is one of the things I'd mentioned to you earlier. It says when you code an anchor link, you can use the href attribute to hard code it. That's how we've done it in the past. You've got your href equals, etc. But they mention here in general, it's considered a best practice to not do it that way. Rather, to use the tag helpers to generate the URL. There are reasons for that we'll talk about in just a moment. But as it says there in the figure, the first example shows two ways to code a link to the same URL. The first is hard-coded, and the second uses a tag helper. All right, so here's the first one, and here's the second one. They're both going to the same place. All right, but as we'll see in a moment, there are advantages to using the second one. The disadvantage of using the second one is it's more typing. All right, I get that. The advantage is if you change names, etc., some of the stuff will automatically be changed for you. So let's go back and look at that. It says there between these approaches, the first is short and easier to read. The second is recommended because it's more flexible. For example, it says if you change the routing for the app, all right, the second approach automatically adjusts. The first approach would break and you'd need to fix it manually by doing a redirect. All right. It says the second example shows you don't need to code the ASP controller tag helper if you were going to an action method in the same controller. This is similar to like if we were talking about a relative URL, all right, as opposed to an absolute URL. All right, so as it says there, the example assumes the link is coded and you are in the same controller because you're not mentioning another controller. All right, it says, of course, if you want to display a view that's in another controller, then you can add the ASP controller tag. So you better do that. It wouldn't hurt to put an ASP controller tag where you put the same controller you're already in, but it's considered superfluous or extraneous because you're putting something that it defaults to anyway. All right. So when you look here, all right. So again, that's in the same controller. That's in another controller. All right. But you'll notice it still is showing the action here and here. It's smart enough here to know what controller you're is, but it's not smart enough to know what to do. And in here, since you want to go to another controller, of course, you'd also have to give it an action. In other words, this about and this list are just the methods that you want to run, for lack of better words. All right. All right. Says the fifth example then shows what happens when you use a tag helper to specify a value for a parameter that doesn't exist. This is also important. All right. Typically, what you want is if it'll be a situation where if you put something in that doesn't exist, you'll want it created. All right. Now, if it doesn't exist and it's null, there's two things that you can program for. Well, you can say, well, if it's null, meaning it's not there, created, or you can also test to say, if it's null, return null, and then handle it that way. And that's what they're saying. But again, the best practice is to use the tag helpers. So it's expected you're going to do it like this. The reason I'm bringing that up as well is we have done some of that in earlier examples. So if you've been like, yeah, why didn't we just do it like this? We've done it like this because that's the recommended way of doing it. All right. Okay. 3 views that use the default and tag helper. So in this example here, pretty simple example, really. All right. Notice with all of these, product, 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 action list. All right. Here, it's just got, again, that the ID is guitars. Okay. And the action is list. And here, the route ID is Fender Stratocaster, and the action is details. All right. So again, it's going to be smart enough to know, depending on where you are or are not, what to do, is what they're saying. So let's go back here, because that might have been a little bit confusing. Okay. So it says here how it says this Razor code block doesn't set the layout property to override the default layout. As a result, these views all use the same underscore layout. So again, it's telling it to render the body of what's currently active, or what you tell it to render. All right. So the first one, as it says, the home index view specifies the level 1 heading for the page, followed by that information. All right. Within this div, there are 3 links. The first link uses tag helpers to specify the product controller and the list method. The second one uses tag helpers for the product controller, the list method, and an ID. The third one uses tag helpers to specify, again, the product controller, but the details method, again, with an ID. So the more information, we're giving it, it'll go exactly where you want it to go, as opposed to a default situation. All right. Now it says here, the product view works much like a home index view. What does that mean? That means that, remember, by default, remember what you get in that home index view. Not a whole heck of a lot. You get the thing along the top that says home and privacy. You get the welcome. And on the bottom, you get the footer that has another link to privacy. So a lot of times what you'll do is you will use the list method of one of your controllers, and you will have that show. All right. As opposed, have that show. And you'll see this at the end of this. I believe that's the way they did it with this guitar example that we'll see at the end of the chapter. All right. Okay. Now it says the 3 views, and this is how they're displayed in the browser. Now, with that said, okay, what do we have? Well, there's what we get by default. Now, you know this as well as I do. This could be set up in a bunch of ways. In other words, this is very similar to what we have. In other words, what we've been doing in the case study, where we've got a thing down there, manage products, manage technicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But this could just as well have been put up on top here, okay, if we wanted to do it that way. So there's a lot of ways this could be done. Or we could do it both ways. We could have up here products, guitars, etc., something like that. All right. So this is what you're showing for the home page. Then they're assuming you click the guitars link. You can see how this changes. So when you click here, it's smart enough that it goes to the product controller, to the list view in the product controller, and it passes guitars, all right, as our ID. So that ID must be set up then as a string. All right. So there's our category of guitars. Again, it's not built yet. So all they have, it looks like, is this one thing in here. So if you click that one thing in there, it's going to show you this. So what's the difference? Well, in here, we've got product list guitars, but now we're clicking one of the guitars that are in there. So we're going to the details page, and the slug that we're adding is the name of the guitar that we've chosen. All right. Again, I'm just going to keep going, because I have to take for granted that if you're not asking questions, that at least it's somewhat making sense. All right. And like I said, what I'm trying to do, for lack of better words, is imagine that you're a little kid and you've got one of those things where you connect the dots. All right. But you don't know your numbers yet. So I'm kind of telling you how to go from here to here to here to here, etc. That's kind of the idea here. All right. It says now we're ready to use some more skills for working with views. So there's even more tag helpers in here. All right. So if we take a look in here, some of these we may have seen before, but I don't think we have. Notice ASP-area. We talked at the end of the last chapter that you can have areas project. They even reference that chapter 6 here. But if you specify area, I'm sorry, ASP-area, you're telling it the area to go to. Now it says specify the area for the URL, but yeah, you're specifying where on the page or where in the project you want it to go. So in this case, it would be an admin area. All right. Then you've got a fragment. Fragments are a little bit different because what fragments allow you to do is they allow you to kind of create a section of code where you can put that section of code. All right. And in fact, I'm talking more about sections. Let's look at fragments like this. All right. If you remember back from the AWD1000 class, we would have, I called them jumps. I don't know what Evan might have called them. But for example, at the bottom of a web page, you might have put a hyperlink in there that said go to top. All right. And what that was you basically told it to do a jump to the ID of top, which you would have near the top of the page. I'm doing that a lot now, and Evan again probably did as well, using that when students are creating navigation menus. All right. That if they've got, a home page, an about page, and a contact page, let's say, we're setting an ID where each one of those is created so that we're able to jump to there. And that's what we're talking about right here. All right. Then the protocol, and you'll notice by default, it's set to HTTP. It says, however, it's common for apps to automatically redirect to HTTPS, even if you specify HTTP. What you will find is if you work in any kind of company that does virtually anything that's either asking for personal information or providing a service where money or something is going to be transacted, it'll be an HTTPS. All right. It's very rare to see sites today that are HTTP sites unless they are sites that hold basically static HTTP, I should say, static web content that doesn't change. All right. So for instance, if I were to go on vacation and take 1,000 pictures and put them out there into a website, I might make that an HTTP because that's just a site for people to view. Other than that, I'd probably make it an HTTPS. All right. Again, you can have an ASP host in there. Okay. So this would say to jump to Fender. For lack of better words, it would be setting up an ID, and then this would be saying to jump to that particular ID. All right. Here they talk about absolute URLs. And just so you know this, the way that this works, it may have been on the previous page. I don't know. There is no problem at all working with relative URLs on the page that you're on. There is no problem at all with doing that. You're jumping around in your page. All right. But if you try to jump out to another website that isn't yours, there can be problems in these using absolute URLs. Look on the bottom here, on the bottom thing that they say, relative URLs are more flexible. Well, that should make sense because they allow your app to work with multiple different hosts. As a result, you should only use an absolute URL when you're coding a link to a more specific host outside of the app that you're in. So in other words, if you are in your website, but you want to jump to another website that's being hosted by a different server than the one you're in, is what they're about. All right. All right. This, much of the stuff that's in here, you already know. They talk about how you can go and take numbers and format them. You know about C for currency, and all these can be upper or lowercase. All right. N for number, P for percent, and you can put any of these. Afterwards, you can put a comma and then the number of places you want it to go to. All right. So here, for example, there's C1, C0, etc. And there's a bunch of ways that you can do this. What they're saying is, and you've seen a little bit of this already, we have done some of the view by stuff where we have done a two-string on it and we formatted it, all right, to currency, for example. Okay, so there really isn't anything that's new there, but what they're saying is when you set this up, you're typically going to set it up in a more numeric way, but when you present it, all right, rather than being in a numeric way, because you should always do this, you would never want to put in a comma there or whatever, or a percent sign. You should always do it like this, but you'll want to display it like this. And even with this one, you'd very well might want to display that as 1, comma 2, 3, 4. So you don't input it or set it up like this, but you do display it like this. And that's all they're really talking about in here. All right. So as they mentioned on the bottom of the page, you can use the C# format specifiers. Okay, nothing really new there. Okay, notice by default, so unless told otherwise, these format specifiers, all right, will return things up to 2 decimal places, but you can put a 0 there or a different number if you want. All right. Now, says the figure presents 3 of the most common specifiers, but there are other ones other than these. If you needed to, you could express your thing in an E type of logarithmic format, and there's other ones as well. These are the ones that they're saying that you'd use most often. All right, it is 1 o'clock. So, and we're coming to the beginning of a new section here. Let's take 10 minutes. We'll pick it up right at 1:10 with how to work with a model. All right, then continuing on, we're on page 256, how to work with a model. And as it says, so far the chapter has shown how to work with views, but not views that are bound to a model. All right. Now, as I mentioned here, the controller typically stores the data for the view in the model. Well, the idea again in here is this whole separation of concerns. In other words, the model is responsible for the data, and that includes setting up the tables and setting up the database. The model is also responsible for the business logic. All right. It should never, the model itself should never be doing anything where it's doing any kind of aesthetic work, CSS like work, etc. All right. Why? Because that's the job of the view. And in the same way, the view should really never be doing anything that involves computation or involves business rules. All right. And that's kind of what they're saying in here. So it says it begins by showing a C# class that defines a product object that can be used as a model. Well, this is very similar to the type of stuff that we've been doing. There's nothing in here that's exactly new, but let's just quickly go through it. All right, first we've got our ID for our product. Well, now we're assuming there's also going to be a category class. All right, you can see that we're also bringing in the foreign key of the category class. All right. And then we're also assuming that each product has a code, has a name, has a price. All right. Now, the other thing that's sort of new in here, I think we've looked at it this way, but I'm not sure, is we're actually putting in the slug. And all that is doing is that, again, is going to be used when we are basically when we are formatting later, when we'll be formatting the URL to say that anything that we put in that's got spaces in it, replace it with dashes. All right. So we've got a product model, we've got a category model. All right. And again, you can hopefully see now, notice here public string name, public string name. This is one of the reasons that I like to go and call these product code, product name, product price, product slug. So in here, I can call this category name. Not everybody agrees with that because I've had people tell me, I understand what you're doing and what you're saying, but it's too much typing. Well, with copy and paste, I don't see how it is, but some people think that it is. All right. So jumping back then. So it talks about how it defines these two things in here. Okay, nothing new. All right, it says the figure continues by showing a class that defines a category. Yeah, we just talked about that. After you define the model, you can create an object from the model and fill that model with data. Well, again, nothing new in there, right? Because we've talked about how to do this stuff before. All right. In here it says if a product with a specified ID is not found, a new product object is created. All right. And it says, and this is some of the code we'll look at in a second. It says if this code wasn't included and the product wasn't found, first or default automatically returns null, which in this case, what they're saying is that wouldn't be what you wanted. All right. After you fill a model with data, you can pass it to a view. And that's pretty much what we've been doing when you think about it. And what I mean is we have in the model, we've been setting up the table. All right. We've also had our context file where we've at least seeded the table with some data. All right. And then in the controller, that's where we basically have called like the list method or the add edit or whatever it happens to be or the delete. All right. And what that is doing then is that is telling the controller to basically run the code associated with that particular method as it's been defined in the view in the CSHTML file. All right. Okay, that was kind of a lot to spit at you, but hopefully that made at least some sense, and that's what they're pretty much trying to show here. All right. Okay, now notice they've got here view model and view name model. So with view model, as it says, it passes the specified model to the corresponding view and creates a view result object. But with the other one, it passes the specified model to the view with the specified name and creates, all right, a view result model. And again, we have talked about stuff like this before, where this is not new, but where they're trying to do some explaining in here, all right, is when they're coming in and they're talking about some of the link stuff in here. All right. So notice the where. What we're saying is we're passing in an ID and we want to be able to search and find that ID in our products table. All right. And what we want to do is we want to include in there, and then notice it says, because we brought that category table in. So we want to be able to include that in there also. And that's basically like when we've had the drop down, that's why rather than having an ID, that's why it's actually, instead of having a category ID, it had the category name in there. All right. And then that first or default with the double question mark in here is it's saying, hey, if you find it, if there's more than one that meets that criteria, return the first one. If you don't find it, this is saying create a new product. All right, because again, otherwise default would return null. So you will either be returning an existing product here or a brand new product there with that ID that was passed in. All right. So a model is a regular C# class that defines an object. In a controller, you can use the view method to pass a model object to a view. All right. It says in this figure, the context variable refers to DB context, which we have talked about for the last several chapters. All right. As far as displaying then model properties in a view, this is one of the things we've talked a little bit about some of this before. It says to start, you can use an @using directive, okay, that specifies the namespace for the model classes. Well, when we start looking in here, this is the thing that we've had in here basically anytime that we've been working with something that's going to be using our models, we have been putting a using statement in there with the name of our application dot models. All right. And you've seen it. In fact, when you don't put it in, when you attempt to come down here and reference things that are in that model, you get an error message. And if you highlight, one of the errors and it'll have the fixes, it'll say, do you want to add this? All right. And that's what they're trying to explain in here. Again, probably much better than I am. So in a view, as they mentioned here, you can use the @model directive, and that's what you're doing. @model with a little m, that's binding the model to the view. Then you use the model with the big M to access the properties of that model object. All right. When you code a form within a view, you typically use the ASP-4 tag to help bind model properties to HTML elements. This makes it easier to write and maintain the code for views. So before we go through, because they've got a couple of examples in here, so before we look at the first example, let's see it in action. All right, so that's it here. So we've already talked about this. All right, so what do we have in here? We've got ASP4 equal name. All right. And we're used to using the regular for equal sign in just a label. And remember what that does is that means that if you click on that label, it automatically places you inside of the input. What we're doing here is we're just basically establishing a relationship. And we're saying we're using the ASP.NET tag helpers to say that this label and this input are both being used, all right, in conjunction with the same field that's in our model, that being the name field or the price field, etc. So that's what they're explaining in here. All right, again, there may be something, they may have worded it a little bit differently, but I'm just trying to give you my take on all this stuff. So they give you a couple of examples of it in here. All right. Now it says, note that the value of the type attribute is determined rather by the data type property of the input. In this example, the price property has a value of decimal. So the type attribute is set to text, meaning that a normal text field is displayed. Well, remember one thing about this. We've talked about this before. This is a view. So we don't have to worry so much about the type. In other words, we're not doing any processing here. When we're working with the view, we're displaying. All right. And that's the key thing. All right. We also have a couple hidden fields here. All right. For both our product ID and for our category name, which means that we're not showing that stuff. It's available to us possibly, but we're not showing it. All right. And then they show you, as it says here, the HTML that's generated for the price label and the input statements from the stuff that's up here. All right. Okay, it says in a form you typically use the ASP4 tag helper to bind model properties to HTML elements such as labels and input elements. And again, that's something that we've been doing all semester long. All right. All right. In much the same way as it says there, you can bind a list of items to a select statement. This again is nothing new. All right, so when we look in here, this is the stuff that we've been doing. All right, and you've seen this. We've had basically, again, where we've been using like a category ID, but what we want to display is the name, that kind of an idea. So this is what they're saying in here. All right, it says the first statement uses the DB context object to get a list of category objects and stores it in a view bag property so it's able to be viewed. All right, the second statement in there is used to find the product object that corresponds to the specified ID. Or if it's not found, again, a new product will be created. We already talked about that. And the third statement that's in there uses the view method to pass the product to the view. So all these things that you see in here are working in conjunction with one another. All right. All right. If you need to display a list of model objects, you can display them in a table. All right. Well, take a look here. Well, they don't show it, but you know what? Isn't that what we've been doing? I mean, the way I look at it, in the case study that we've been working on with Sports Pro, all right, when you look again, we've got managed products, that's managing one model. We've got managed technicians, that's managing another model. We've got, all the other ones that are in there. And that's pretty much what we're doing. And that's what's being explained right here. All right. So it says the first example shows a controller action method named list that creates the model and passes it to the view. Next, the action method uses the ID parameter to get the list of product objects for the selected category. All right, it uses an if statement to determine whether it should get all products or it should filter them by category. Then it's got to know, it says the last statement uses the view method to pass the list of product objects, all of them or just the ones in that category, to the view. All right. The next example, very similar, it says, shows the code to display a list of products in the table. It uses the at model, as it says, to bind them. Okay. Next, it uses an inline to check whether the categories property has been set. If so, it wants to only show the products that are in that category. If not, it's basically going to show all and show all products. All right. And that's what they're saying in here. So, I mean, the best way to approach this, if you're having trouble with it, I think at least, is to read a little bit, but then look at the code and say, okay, and then, or have both pages open, which I guess you can do. And that's again why Murach sets their books up like they do. All right. And kind of go through it that way. And hopefully when it makes at least some sense. All right. And as always, even though there's nothing on the bottom, take a look at the bottom when there is stuff there that summarizes everything. All right. Okay. And then there's just more of the same in here. So let's take a look at the code that's in here. Well, you already know this kind of thing. What are we doing in here? All right. For each product that's in the model, we want to be producing, as it says here, the product name, all right, the product price. And so you can see the name and the price. And then we are adding to that our details, okay, which says view. And we are adding our ID, which says update. So think about this then. This right here, this is our table because that's our data. This is allowing us then to come in and it is associating with view the product ID for the current product. So when we call view, it's going to be calling the method, since we're passing it an ID, it will only be showing us details, which only shows us a single product. It's not all, or it's not list. On the other hand, in a similar way, we're again passing the ID in here. So when we're calling update, rather than saying update what, we are updating the product with that ID. So in other words, there's our data, and we can view just that piece, that data, or we can update just that particular, in this case, the Fender Stratocaster. All right. Next, how to work with Razor layouts. And it says, so far in this book, you've learned to create web apps that use a single Razor layout. And you've been setting this as the default. So all views, as it says, use this layout. So they're all set up the same way. However, as it says, as your app becomes more complex, you may need additional Razor layouts. Let's think about two situations where that would be the case. The first would probably be if you went in and you created an area, and in that area, you created an admin interface. You may decide that you want the admin interface to look quite different from the quote regular user interface unquote. How so? Well, you could change that if you were using one color for a background and then maybe a darker color for a background and light text, you could use a light color background with dark text. I'm not saying you'd have to do that, but you could. All right. Or as an example, maybe if you had different types of customers, maybe you would want the layout to change. So in other words, if somebody is a retail customer, you might want to give them one view of the layout. And if they're a wholesale customer, you might want to give them another view of the layout. All right. And then one more thing to consider is, again, what do you do if you do run into an error situation? You might want a totally different layout where, for example, in there, you might want uh, a white screen with red text or a red screen with white text, etc. All right. So those are just a couple of examples. Okay. In chapter 2, it says we learn how to use Visual Studio to add a Razor layout to the web app. In particular, you learned how to add a layout like underscore layout, that file presented earlier in the chapter. And it's not even so much that we learned that, it's just that it was one of those things provided for us when we created the project. All right. So it says in the next figure, it shows the code for a layout file named underscore main layout. All right. And again, it says that this is put in the shared folder. The advantage of putting it into the shared folder is that it can be used by more than one view. If we put it into a folder like a products folder, then it could only be used directly by the stuff in products. All right. So it says here the code in this main layout works much like the code for the layout file. However, within the body element, it includes header and footer elements that define a header and footer for the page. All right, and notice it says the header contains 3 links, home, products, and about. All right, and the footer, well, they both have a horizontal rule, big deal, along with copyright information. All right, so maybe you don't want to display that by default. Maybe there's only certain pages that you want to display this information. And the example, in a way at least, is a little convoluted. All right, because I would think that if you were going to have a separate layout and you were going to use it for some, it would be because there's going to be something that maybe you want to show on this page that you don't want to show on other pages, or vice versa. All right. Okay, the second example there, it says shows the code in the view start file that sets the layout property to the layout named underscore layout. Well, okay, notice in the home index, we're setting the layout property to underscore main layout. So if we look in here, all right, this is our main layout. So again, what's different? Well, we've got this header and we've got this footer, and we may have a header. We may have a header in our underscore layout file. We may have a footer in our underscore layout file, but since we'd be using this particular layout, that would supersede those. The main part is the same. It's render body in both. This is when we use this one right here, this says use the main one. But again, notice the code in the home index. All right, you would be specifying then at the top a different layout. So if you left this out, it would be as though you put in layout equals underscore layout. If we didn't have a main layout. All right. So anyone that uses the default layout, even though it's not typically in there, it would be like layout equals underscore layout. And that's what they're saying. And in this case, we're seeing this at the top and we're seeing this at the bottom. All right. And again, an example of where you might want to really change the layout would be if you had an area for admins. Because what you might want to do instead of this is you might want to have something like, maybe, what we're going to be moving towards eventually. Right now, everybody can do everything. But think about this guitar website. You wouldn't want users to be able to go in there and change the price. All right. You wouldn't want users to be able to go in there and delete things. Those would be administrators, but the admin portion isn't shown until the end of the book. That said, if we had a layout for admins, it might be things like add a new product, update an existing product, delete an existing product, etc. And as it says on the bottom there, a project can contain multiple Razor layouts. So different views can use different layouts. Just be cognizant of the fact that if every page has a different layout, you lose that kind of look and feel that you get when you have only one underscore layout file. It's not that it's wrong, but if there's too much in between pages, it could make it hard for a quote regular end user unquote to be able to understand what's happening. All right. All right. You can also nest layouts. What does that mean? You can put a layout inside of a layout. All right. And it says there, in general, it's considered a good practice to avoid code duplication because usually it makes your code easier to maintain. And that's why, as it says, you can avoid code duplication by nesting one layout within another layout. All right. So it says here, the layout named underscore main layout here sets the layout property to the underscore layout. All right. But as we take a look in here, what do we have? Well, we still have layout equals underscore layout, but then we're telling it to add to that this. All right. So it's, for lack of better words, it's a layout within a layout. and then they're showing it in here, okay? All right. Next, they talk about view context, and as it says, a layout can use the view context property to get data about the context of a current view, such as its route. All right, then it can use this data to perform formatting tasks, such as setting the active navigation link. So it's meant to provide information to make it easier when the system is trying to figure out where to go. So if we look at the example here, it says it presents a modified version of the main layout presented earlier. To start, the Razor code block for this uses the view context property to get the current controller in action rather. So that's what we're doing in here. We're saying use the main layout. All right. But then we now have access to the current controller. We now have access to the current action in that current controller. So it says for the example here, the current controller is the product controller and the action is list. All right. Then it displays the product link. Otherwise, this code doesn't set an active attribute for the products link. It shows it as being inactive. What does that mean? Well, you kind of know, I think, what it means. All right. Where that if this was the guitar website and they had a certain guitar, but it was out of stock, all right, for this active, if it was not active, you could gray the picture out, or you could put a message in there that would say something like out of stock if you wanted to or needed to do that. All right, sections I mentioned a little bit before, but I want to say it again now. As it says, the table at the top of the page displays the render section. All right, so this allows you to insert content from someplace, all right, with some name into the layout. All right, as it says, if the section is required, all views must include a section with a specified name, because if it's required, all right, for all views, so in other words, if you have to put it in and you don't have it there, it'll be an error. What is that? What does that mean? Well, let's think about it. Possibly, I mean, this is just what came to mind. It may not be a good example, but a section that you might want to put in and make available on every page would be some legal requirement. All right. Or if we decided we wanted to keep that privacy there, maybe we would want some kind of a section that could be made available on each page. So if people wondered about the privacy restrictions on our website, they could bring them up. All right. So going back to here then, says the method is similar to render body, except that you can use it to insert the content of a named section in a view. All right. Not an entire view itself, but just something into the view is what they're saying. All right. Says to give you examples of how this works, the examples here show how to insert optional script elements into a layout. All right. So what do we have here? These scripts. So that's this stuff. Well, the way they're showing it is not exactly the way I explained it, but what this is doing, it is selectively including jQuery into this page, all right, with the render section. So it is making not only our popper, our bootstrap, etc., but it's making the jQuery validate stuff accessible into here. All right. And, would you need to do that in every section? Probably not. That would really, something like that with jQuery validation might be necessary if you were using and working with a view where you were updating data or adding data. But if you were just viewing all data, there would be no reason to have that. So if you were doing basically a list type of operation or a details where you were just displaying a current record, you wouldn't need this stuff. All right. I mean, I looked at it more the other way, I guess a little differently from the book, that what you could do is you could basically add information into a page that wasn't necessarily needed in all pages. That is what they said, but I looked at it more rather than being able to selectively add files in, that you could selectively add code in. So for instance, maybe you only wanted your legal stuff maybe you want it on the footer of every page, but maybe you only wanted on the footer of your main page, for example, something like that. So you could add it in there. That's the way I looked at this. All right. So the rest of the chapter here, and there's only about 5 or 6 more pages, but the rest of the chapter, I want to take a couple minutes and go over this. So it says to show the skills described in chapters 6 and 7 and how they fit together. All right. Within a semi-realistic website, this chapter ends by showing the user interface for the guitar website that's included in the download for the book. Now, what's nice about this, so this will be really for the first time, it's also going to show images. All right. It says if you study the user interface, you might be able to guess how it uses some of the skills that are in the last 2 chapters. But really, the best way to study it is to open it in Visual Studio. All right, run it and see how it works and study the code files. It says to help you understand, they have put more comments in than they would normally put in here. In addition, the exercise at the end of the chapter guides you through the process of reviewing the code and modifying it to make improvements to the website. Now, that's great. And normally I would say to you, you know what, I'm going to do that. And I'm going to give you that as part of the assignment. However, to my knowledge, this being an end of chapter exercise, you already have the answers. But if you're struggling at all, it would be a good time or a good place to go back and take a look at it. All right, so let's look here. Figure 721, it says shows 2 pages of the user interface available to end users or customers. Both display the same navigation bar at the top of the page, the same footer at the bottom, and it says because they use the same layout. The list page includes a column of categories on the left side that customers can use to select the category of products. All right, then if they want to know more about a certain product, they can click the view details. All right, and the view details, as mentioned, also includes an image. All right, on both pages, the customer can add the product to the cart, but since they haven't gotten to that point yet, it probably won't be till around chapter 12, but it could be a little earlier. I don't remember. All right, we'll talk about that at that time. If the user clicks the admin link, the website displays the admin pages shown. This is what I said to you before. Typically, a website would require admin users or administrators to log in. But since they don't discuss in this book authorization and authentication till near the end of the book, the feature isn't implemented yet by the website. All right. So they do show you here 4 different pages, not the next page or 2, but the ones after that will show you the 4 pages for administrators. All right. Now, so this is basically the list page you'd see when you bring this up. All right. And you can see we have everything in here. We've chosen guitars, but there are guitars, there are bass guitars, and there are drums if you click all. But here they've chosen guitars. You've already seen this kind of thing. So the name and the price of each guitar. If you click the view details for the second one, the Gibson Les Paul, this is what you get. And you'll notice there is I thought they said you could add it to your card from either here. There's an add to cart here, and there's an add to cart here. All right. And then the last 4 pages that are shown in here, all right, are these different product manager pages. All right. So these are the admin pages, in other words. So we can add a new product. We can update an existing product. All right. And when we click the add a new product, this is what comes up. Not really anything new. And we can delete an existing product. Now, I want to mention something before we finish up here. Okay. What I've been doing so far is I've been going in and I've been creating these products myself when I run into problems. Have I looked once or twice at the key? Yes, I'm not going to lie to you. All right. But I've tried to bring this across in a way that makes sense. All right. Evan, when he's done this, because I talked to him about this, basically has said he's doing it kind of the same way, but he's using, whereas, for example, I would say instead of um, having a product ID, then a name, then a code, I'm using product name and product code. He is not. So what he has been able to do has been, when he runs into any trouble, is he can just go in and um, he can go in and create basically just, bring up the author's key, do a migration. In fact, I don't even think know if he's done migrations. He might just be doing the update database and his has worked. I've had nothing but problems. And I don't think it's just because of a naming thing that I'm adding product name versus name, but he's had no problems. I sent him an email yesterday. He has not yet responded, but I said that with the one that we were working on yesterday for 6.1, he like I said, he told me he used the one in the book. Well, like I told you, that one had a startup.cs file that is not in here anymore. So I told him what we did, and I told him the error, because I continue to get a lot of errors in these different things that I run, where it comes up, and when I run it, it tells me something is null, where it shouldn't be null. All right. And I've asked him if he'd take a look at that. All right. And I'm going to keep taking a look at it. So with all that said, let's just very quickly, when you get to, we already talked about the thing for chapter 6, so there's nothing new there. But for 7, it says we're going to modify the Sports Pro website so it uses some of the stuff in chapter 7. All right. So the navigation bar with the product manager page displayed. Okay. And there's the one with the technician page displayed. All right. So when you look in here, there's not very many requirements. Get all the navigation links for things we've talked about to work correctly. What does that mean? That means that the home link, the products link, the technicians link, the customers link, and the incidents link, all of those should work. We haven't talked about registration yet. The about should also work because we did that earlier. All right. Convert the razor for each that displays the items for the select so that it uses the tag helper instead. There was an example of that in your book. All right. I would suggest that when you get to that part of it, don't remove what's there, because hopefully at least it's working. Rather, comment it out. All right. And then worry about adding the other stuff in there. Finally, remove the jQuery libraries for validation and only include them in views where necessary, such as for add edit. So when do you have to validate? You have to validate for edit. Do you have to validate for delete? Not that I know of. You're just clicking the button for it, right? So not for delete. Do you have to validate for list? No. Okay. So really the add edit should be the only time in there that you're going to have to go back and selectively add these libraries. And that's what we looked at the end of the chapter. So that's what you'll be doing for chapter 7 for the case study. And as far as this is kind of different, because they're telling you, it says in this project, you're going to build a multi-page web app yourself. And it's going to look like this. So when you look at this, it will have a help area in it. All right. This whole thing right here up till this line with the view start, all this stuff So imagine I'm drawing a square around this. All right. That is all going to be in that area help. Okay. And then you will make a home controller. You will have your about, your contact, etc. And then they show you in here the help area, and it's pretty simple. Okay. Tutorial page 1. Here's the first thing you need to know about my website. Then here's the second thing you need to know about my website. And here's the third thing you need to know. So in other words, that looks to me like that would be some content that you could use, but you'll have to make the buttons work, where if you're on page 1, you can do a next, but not a previous. If you're on page two rather, you can do a previous or a next. And if you're on page 3, you can only do a previous. All right. So that'll be that stuff. That'll be what you're going to implement here in the help area. In addition, you've got an about and a contact. So here's the contact. You're just going to set that up. Not a lot of stuff to put in there. All right. But notice this is the main view. Home, about, and contact. And then there's help. All right. So you'll want to set it up like that. And your specs are shown right here. All right. Hopefully that helped at least somewhat. I give you my word that right now, between now and 4 o'clock, I'm going to go in and try to make what we worked on yesterday work. All right. And if I get it to work, all right, I will let you know tomorrow exactly what I did in order to make it work. And if I get it to work, so if 6.1 works, I'm going to jump right into 6.2, where all we had to do, remember, for 6.2 was to add the attribute routing as it's shown right here. All right, so I'm going to try to do both. All right, if I get that done, then, watch your email tomorrow, and I will let you know that if I get that done, we will have a class tomorrow and I will explain that stuff to you. All right. In addition, if I can get all that done, I'm going to start on 7.1. I would like you to try to do this one by yourselves. All right. I think you all can. And then tomorrow, basically, other than if I get this done and explain it to you, you'll have most of the period. Probably if nothing, at most I'll lecture for an hour tomorrow, if at all. The rest of the period will be lab. Friday will be lab. Again, there's nothing due this weekend, but on Monday of next week, you've already seen this. I mentioned it in the emails, but on Monday, we're going to jump into chapter 8, another fairly long chapter. All right. And as it says, so far this book is focused on using action methods of a controller to get data from the model layer. This chapter presents more detail, again, kind of the innards, so to speak, about how this works. In addition, as it says, it presents new ways to transfer data from the controller to a view or from one controller to another controller. And they actually have an app in here. They call it the NFL Teams app, that when you look at it, it'll show you kind of everything here. All right. So you can choose all, or you can do it by conference and then by division in the conference. All right. So if you do all AFC East, you get this. All right. And there's even something else. I don't remember what the other layer in this was, but there's something else because there was another picture in here. I don't remember what it was. So this is what we will look at on Monday. I will ask that please, if you get time, try to take a look at the exercise that is at the end. You don't have to do it. And yes, you even have the answers, but try to look at the exercise that is at the end of chapter 7 that talks about using the guitar stuff. I'm going to work right now, as I told you, I'm going to work on trying to fix 6.1. All right. And if I can't, if I still have trouble, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this up, modifying the guitar website, and I'm going to look and see what they did, if theirs worked, that I didn't do. All right, so I'm going to go through their code, and I mean, there'll be different, the controllers will be, a little different, but the logic is virtually going to be not identical, but similar. All right. So unless you have any questions, I'm done. Do either one of you have any questions? All right. Then we'll call it a class for today. I will send you an email tomorrow to let you know what kind of progress I did or did not make. All right. And I will talk to you then. Have a good day.